Okay. Okay, if anything goes wrong with with the screen or anything, let me know. Okay, so I just wanted to start out first with a little bit of introduction about myself. Um, just to contextualize how I got to what I'm doing here and how I started with language study, actually. I'm originally from Los Angeles. I don't have any background, personal family background in Russia or Eastern Europe. Um, but I was really interested in study abroad, and I actually picked Dartmouth College because of I wanted a school that guaranteed me a possibility to do study abroad. And actually, I was really set on going to France. And I went to France in the winter spring of 1990, which was right after the Berlin Wall fell in November 1989. And at that time, I traveled around Europe and I just got really interested in what was happening in Europe, what was happening with the Soviet Union. Um, I didn't have any background in European studies. So from French, I switched to German because I had met a lot of people in Eastern Europe that spoke German. But actually, Dartmouth had an award-winning Russian language program, and actually Jennifer taught at Dartmouth in there for a while. So um, I finally switched to Russian, and I started taking Russian intensively in as an undergraduate, and then in the summer, including summer language programs like at Indiana in Russia, and then I continued to go to Russia, and I spent 2.5 years there doing field work in the 1990s. So even though I didn't have that background, I just got interested in it, and the language study was really my entree into focusing on the region. Um, sorry. Oh, here we are. Okay. All right. So, Jennifer discussed my research interests. I want to just note that I was always interested in regions, in sovereignty movements, in local people, and how they understand various things, including regional understandings of the economy. And that was my first book, Imagined Economies. And from that, I got interested in the topic of identity more generally and how to measure identity, and how to do that in a kind of cross-national um, way, and with different people in different disciplines, etc. And another kind of seemingly different but related project I got interested in was in national accounts and GDP and how countries measure economic growth, because that also varies across countries, but there's international norms for doing that. So again, I kind of was interested in the national and different ways of doing things across countries. Um, I'm currently still working on different identity projects, now on trust. I'm finally finishing a long project on jazz and race in Russia, which has to do with African American musicians going to Russia and their treatment in Russia. Okay. Um, Let me switch now to our topic at hand, which is the issue of identity in the Russian war on Ukraine. So, when the Russian war, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine started in February 2022, a lot of people had questions about why it started, what Russia really wanted, etc. And in my opinion, this brought up questions about identity because I think that it became very clear early on that identity was an important explanation to the cause of this war, um, the way the war was being conducted, and also a consequence of the war. So in our political science terms, we would call it a variable, an independent variable in causing the war, and an outcome variable or dependent variable in the course of the war. And just to give a few examples here, this image on the upper left is the sort of little booklet treatise that Putin wrote in the summer of 2021 on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, where he essentially denies the nationhood of Ukraine. And that book and that outlook turned out to be very important in Russia's conduct of the war. And it's something that people have tried to study to see whether he really meant it or not. And I think much of the evidence is that he does actually believe that. Um, Alternatively, on the upper right, there's a image of the Holodomor Memorial in Kyiv, which is a memorial to the um, famine of Ukrainians in the early 1930s that many Ukrainians consider and others consider to be a genocide, one of the no numerous times you could say that Russia has tried to destroy the Ukrainian nation. And this is one of the reasons a lot of regional experts, including people like myself, did not think Russia would be successful in trying to take over Ukraine because Ukrainians were very dedicated to maintaining their nationhood and maintaining their sovereignty. And so many regional experts just thought Ukrainians would not resist, would not give up. But of course, and they have not. Um, but nevertheless, despite what seems like an obvious fact, Russia had a different Russia, the country, political leadership, and people had a different understanding of their relationship with Ukraine. Something I think that's important to understand is that I think Russia's imperial sense of identity, their idea that they should be the boss of everywhere in the former Soviet space and in the former Russian Empire, as well as Russian national identity, are really important factors in starting the war and also, unfortunately, in the genocidal conduct of the war. This image on the left is a picture from Bucha, which I think many people have heard of. This is where Russians were stuck in their attempt to take over the capital, Kyiv. They ended up being stuck outside of Kyiv, and they committed a lot of atrocities in the towns in which they were um, uh, holding out. And a lot of that information came out in April and May of 2022, so just right into the war. And that led to a lot of reconsiderations of what was happening and what this war was going to be about. Um, I just want to get this last image up. There we are. Okay. On the right-hand side is a picture from a May 9th celebration in Russia, and this turns out to be another way in which identity is connected to the war, where Russia has celebrated its victory over Nazi Germany in 1945, and it's become almost a cultish fascination with the Putin regime to celebrate this victory over the Nazis as the greatest um, sort of greatest victory Russia has had in the 20th century. And they are kind of repeating this narrative of victory over Nazis in this war with Ukraine, where they're calling the Ukrainian government Nazis. And by that, they mean that Ukraine is against Russia. They have actually, Russia today, and even Stalin at the time, had very little interest or concern with the Holocaust or with Germany's treatment of Jews. And they were mostly concerned with Nazi Germany's attack on the Soviet Union, of course, after their secret pact. But nevertheless, the problem with the Nazis for Stalin was their attack on the Soviet Union, not other things they were doing in terms of genocide, etc. There's two other images. This is on the bottom left picture from Buryatia, set of funerals in May 2022. And this is another sort of interesting aspect of the war, that there are a lot of non-Russians fighting on the side of Russia, including ethnic Buryats, um, Chechens, others. And within Ukraine, as I think many people probably know by now, there's a mixture of different people, ethnic Russians, ethnic Ukrainians, Crimean Tatars, other groups. Um, and the war has not broken down along ethnic lines of ethnic Ukrainians versus ethnic Russians. Instead, there's a variety of ethnicities fighting on both sides, and also, for our purposes, interestingly, a variety of languages. A lot of Ukrainians are native Russian speakers. Um, so there's that connection as well. And so I just think it's another interesting aspect of the war that ethnicity is not been per se ethnicity the site of the cause, the main cause of conflict, which I'll get to in a minute. Another thing I think that's related, these are just sort of like aspects of identity that are related to the war that motivated this research I'm doing, is that Ukrainian identity has been transformed during this war and actually even after the first invasion of Crimea in 2014, in the sense that there is a renewed commitment not only to Ukrainian sovereignty, but the commitment to the Ukrainian nation and Ukrainian language is has been transformed as a matter of these conflicts in ways that nationalists from the early 1990s could never have imagined the level of support for Ukrainian language in Ukrainian nationhood. But also what it means to be Ukrainian has changed. This last image on the right is a picture from that I took from Lviv, a field of Mars or a veteran cemetery um, last year, and it's um, just a small illustration of the losses for Ukraine and the care that people take with the fallen soldiers. So, one of the things that I think became clear in the overall understanding of identity in this war is that, on the one hand, imperial and national identity were very important, but on the other hand, ethnicity per se was not the primary cause. And this is important in the political science literature because there's so much focus on ethnicity as a cause of conflict. Okay. So overall, I'm not going to go through my whole paper here, but I have written a paper based on the experiences of the Russian war in Ukraine, but addressing a question of what identity can contribute to understanding war more generally. And I focus on three things: the causes of war. So, as I discussed a little bit earlier, identity can be motivating for conflict. So, this image here is kind of telling this is Putin meeting with his national security team before the war. And you can see the room in the Kremlin and the statues in the background and how far away people are sitting from him. That's, I don't know, his own psychosis or COVID concerns or something, or assassination concerns. But the idea of Russia as this grand empire taking what's theirs is clearly one of the motivations for this war. There's other motivations and there's other things I'm happy to go into, but I think identity concerns are one of the aspects, one of the important aspects of this war. So more generally, I think we can think of identity as part of the causes of war in terms of motivation for conflict. Another way to think about it is in terms of intergroup relations and how groups see each other, whether they see each other as friends or enemies, and identity can affect the evaluation of behavior of different groups. So the same thing could happen, but you might see it differently if you see that group as an enemy group versus an ally. And also, this is an area of a lot of my research is focused on the interpretation of information and how identity affects how people understand information, how they understand whether an accidental bombing is actually an accident or whether it's purposeful or whether they see movement of people or something like that as threatening or not. So there's a lot of ways in which identity affects the causes of war. A second way to think about identity in war is in terms of the conduct of war. Identity is related to the mobilization of soldiers and willingness to fight, and you see this on both sides that this war has not been popular in Russia, and one of the few things that has stopped Putin domestically is the drafting of soldiers or forced mobilization. He did that once, but he's understands that that's like highly unpopular. Ukraine has a volunteer army, so they have also struggled with getting people to fight, but for somewhat different reasons, because of the costliness of it, the concern about their lives, but not because people are not committed to the overall cause. I think identity also affects the behavior during war, and especially this has to do with norms and professionalization of militaries, but also what militaries think is acceptable or not behavior. And we can see on the Russian side that their willingness to commit war crimes, if not genocide, has been widespread throughout the war and not restricted to a small number of anomalous cases. So identity overall, I think, can affect the way that the war is fought, the willingness of individuals to get involved, and then the larger domestic support for the war, which does matter in democracies, but even dictatorships like Putin's dictatorship does have to be concerned with some level of overall public support. And finally, identity can affect the consequences of war and especially changes in social identity. And that kind of relates back to what I was saying about the transformation of Ukrainian national identity. But I would say actually this war is also transforming Russia because it's actually bringing people into connection with the state in ways that they haven't been for a long time and probably wish they weren't. Um, okay. Let me just switch to a little bit of political science discussion about identity per se and how we can study it. And I wanted to start with just the idea of types of identities. So maybe I should have started this talk this way, but I wanted to start with some of the connections to Ukraine. Um, so as I understand identity, it's a social category that can vary in terms of content, so what the meaning of identity is, and how people agree or disagree about it, or what we call contestation. And importantly, there are a lot of different types of social identities. Ethnicity is one, national identity, religious identity. You could have linguistic identity, gender, transnational identity, different kinds of identities. And so I guess like my first point is these are not all the same, but they're also not completely different. There's some ways in which some identities are similar to others and some ways in which they are different. So some identities, for example, are relational in that you can't have one without the other. Class identity is a example here where you don't really have lower class if you don't have middle class or upper class. It's a distinction of groups into to different levels or categories, and they are relational to each other. Ethnicity is not necessarily that way. There may be ethnic groups that have historic enemies like China, Japan, but Chinese don't exist as a matter of disaggregating themselves, say, from Nigerians. Like that's just not necessarily part of their way of thinking. So not every identity category is relational. Some have specific norms. Religious identities often have formal norms like no fish on Friday, or sorry, no meat on Friday for Catholics, um, that are, or rituals around birth, death, and marriage, etc., that are formalized. Whereas a lot of ethnic groups don't necessarily have formal rules to be a member of the group. So there's ways in which identities, different kinds of identities, can be similar to each other, but can be different. And a lot of my work on measurement and definition of identity was thinking about how to categorize different groups and what they have in common or not. Another factor is personal versus social identity. And that just really means that an individual can hold a number of different identities and have, uh, debates within themselves about how do I feel today? Do I feel like a student? Do I feel like a gardener? Do I feel like a baseball player? Different kinds of things. But a social identity requires agreement or disagreement across groups on what the identity means, what the content is, etc. And that changes the way that we study it. A lot of international relations scholar actually treats states in terms of personal identity. So they might study Putin personally in order to understand the Russian state. But in comparative politics and American politics, we often look at mass identities that have to do with that you would study through public opinion, or you try to find out through interviews or different ways how large groups of people think about things and whether they agree or disagree on different things. So if you think about identities as a social identity, it brings up the issue of contestation and it brings up the methodological need to understand more than one person or more than just the assumed state identity of how people are thinking about it. And finally, in studying identity, there's questions to be made about focusing on elites or masses. And the decision making with regard to identity and war can be at different levels. So certainly the decision to invade Ukraine was made by Vladimir Putin, and this is an elite choice. But there is clearly also mass support for the war that's important to the maintenance of the military, et cetera, that goes beyond elites. And so that's another aspect of studying identity and conflict to think about is where the locus of decision making is. It's actually a matter of debate within people looking at this war, how much support within Russia is there for the war and how much is it an elite choice. And it's hard to know in authoritarian countries because you can have governments making decisions that are unpopular, and a lot of times they get away with it because of their use of coercion or other tactics. Okay, so those are some definitional and methodological points. One other point I want to make, that's kind of a larger point, is that there's kind of an overemphasis on ethnicity in political science scholarship when it comes to the study of identity. Some people even just use the word ethnic to describe all identities. Like, so you'll see a paper on Iraq talking about ethnic conflict between Sunni and Shia, which is not really an ethnic conflict. It's a religious sectarian difference. And as I say, like when you go back into what different identities entail, you see that it's not appropriate to call everything ethnic. Um, this is some of the political science literature here. There's been a lot on precise definitions of what ethnicity is, and we basically agree on it these days that it is a matter of a belief in shared common descent. So shared common descent. If you don't think you have shared common descent, you don't really have an ethnic group. In work with a former graduate student from UW, Kyle Markart, who actually he speaks 7 languages and he's really, really interested in language. And he's actually a high-level methodologist. But we did a lot of work on language versus ethnic identity. What's in so-called ethnic data sets, a lot of them contain other things. The Soviets actually defined ethnic groups not as ethnic per se, but as ethno-linguistic groups. And actually, Soviet work from the 1960s remains the basis for most data sets in political science on, quote, ethnicity, but also even on religion, even though the Soviets eschewed studying religion because they thought it was not important. They did very much focus on language as a basis for ethnic distinction. Another point I want to make is that there's lots of ethnic groups and there's not that much ethnic conflict. And this point is made actually by a paper by James Farron and David Layton in 2003 that a lot of this is studying the onset of civil wars, that a lot of civil wars are not actually based on ethnic groups, but nevertheless, people still think that ethnicity is the basis for conflict. But um, and sometimes people think ethnicity is the basis for cooperation, like everybody in the same ethnic group has higher levels of trust or sharing or good treatment towards each other. But actually, it varies a lot, and that's where the contestation issue comes. So I just think there's an overemphasis on ethnicity as the basis for both conflict and cooperation. And I think the Ukraine case shows some of the problems with that. Um, as I was just saying, there's a lot of contestation and differences within groups. In a pretty serious study from 2009, a set of authors tried to look at whether co-ethnics in different African countries actually trust and cooperate and care more about each other than they do with other groups. And their findings were really minimal. There was a few instances where they could find this, but in general, ethnicity was not the basis for trust and cooperation. Um, and so And then just the final thing is that often ethnicity works in conjunction with other factors, economic incentives, power, institutions, etc. So, and I think that's the case in this war too, that um, Russian imperial identity and nationalism in Russia are a big part of the explanation and the motivations for this conflict. But the way that the war has gone on has to do with a lot of other things, including the material resources for both sides and also the cooperation and support from other countries. But another factor, I think, is that there was a serious miscalculation on the part of the Russians in terms of what they would face in Ukraine and what they would face internationally. Although I would argue that one of the reasons for this misunderstanding of the reaction by the rest of the world and by Ukrainians has to do with this imperial lens that Putin was looking at the world from. They didn't really bother to study Ukrainian capabilities or consider serious resistance because they were so set on the idea that they deserve this territory and that the Ukrainians wouldn't fight based on their own understandings of themselves, rather than any serious analysis of what Ukraine was likely or capable of doing. Okay, just to wrap up, I'm just going to bring it around to the final uh, bit on how the war might end. These are some quotes from, this is former President and Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev standing in front of a map last year where Russia, you can see the expanded Russia. You can see that Russia has graciously given Romania some part of Ukraine, Poland some part of Ukraine. Moldova continues to exist, but Russia has taken a lot of its coastline, and there's sort of a rump Kiev state. And in answering these little quotes are, uh, this was at a geography conference for kids. Somebody asked Putin where Russia's borders end, and Putin answered, Russia's borders do not end anywhere. Um, and this quote also that Ukraine is, of course, Russia. So this is still the way that Russia, this is last year, but still, I think, reflects there's lots of other statements that Russia's maximalist goals in the war have not changed. I think something I want to really emphasize is that this war is about the denial of Ukrainian sovereignty, which is freedom from external threats, as you can see from this map there, and the destruction of Ukraine as a nation. I think these are the key goals of Russia, and they really have not changed very much in the war, even despite the pressure of the military losses and the so-called peace process, discussion of ceasefire, etc. Russia has not changed its goals. And for that reason, I think that ideas about giving Russia what it currently controls, um, that's not going to stop these aspirations for overall control of Ukraine or the destruction of the Ukrainian nation. I think a ceasefire is likely to lead to a pause and restitution of forces in both Russia and Ukraine. Although um, many people, just because of the exhaustion of the war, etc., are in favor of a ceasefire, at least on the Ukrainian side, because obviously who wants to be bombed? But the problem is that Russia has shown no interest whatsoever in stopping its bombing of civilian sites, nor of its military um, offensives. Um, okay, a military defeat would stop Russia, but it's going to take a very long time and it's very costly. Sorry, the little Y is left out there. So that would have been the ideal scenario. Well, not ideal, but that would have been a scenario that would stop Russia, but that's very costly. On the Ukrainian side, they're strongly motivated to keep fighting despite the difficult odds because they are very committed to maintaining their state and their nation. So that means that both sides are committed to keep fighting, and that's why we see the war continuing. And that's why the other two things that are on the table right now continue to be external military support for Ukraine and ramping up of sanctions. So I think that's where I see things going. Fortunately, not like the best news, but also it could be worse. Ukraine has managed to maintain its state and largely keep Russia to the initial gains from about the first month of the war, so about 20% of the territory of Ukraine after 3 years of fighting. So it's terrible, but I guess it could be worse. Um, so on that positive note, I guess I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to answer questions about identity more generally or about the war. Thank you very much.